Hello and welcome back to the Life on the Wrist podcast. We are going to follow up on last week's podcast where we discussed the New York watch auctions that are taking place next month, and we sort of did a preview of some of the major watch houses, including Sotheby's and Phillips. This episode, we are going to be covering a few topics, one of those being our sort of New York watch auction preview for Christie's. At the time of recording last week's podcast, Christie's had not released their catalog, so I will be spending some time going through their catalog and some interesting picks from there. We'll also talk about some modern watches that have been released, mainly sort of limited edition or sort of event-driven pieces. And then I'll finish up the podcast with a few vintage watches that we're going to be covering on lifeonthewrist.com and the Life on the Wrist YouTube channel. As always, we kind of give a preview on the podcast before we sort of dive into them. We did release an article and video about the three pieces, so if you haven't seen that, be sure to head over to our website or our YouTube channel, and you can see the three watches. I'll also leave links in the show notes of this podcast to the three watches, so you can see some pictures of them before we get into sort of the videos. So I'll start off actually with some of the modern watches that were released. So if you know me, you know that I'm a very big football fan, soccer for those who are in the USA. and limited edition pieces are for specific teams were quite common, but they've kind of become not so common now. But what was really cool is Tudor released a limited edition Black Bay 58 for Inter Milan's 20th title, which I thought was a pretty cool celebration. Tudor has we've seen probably in the last year a few more of these sort of limited edition Tudors with these unique stamps on them, which I think is quite cool. I think there was there's I think Hodinkee Black Bays. I think there's also I want to say Facebook Black Bays that are out there. Obviously, limited editions very, very hard to get, given sort of the the reason why they were produced. But I think this is a really nice example of one that was a little bit more celebrated, a little bit larger. So what you have is a stainless steel Tudor Black Bay to celebrate Inter Milan's winning of the league. The watch has the Milan logo and 2 stars on the dial below, kind of closer to 6 o'clock. The 2 stars are obviously indicating 10 titles that are won for each star, so 20 titles in total. The dial has also been, is sort of this really nice blue color that matches the very iconic blue for Inter Milan, which I think is quite cool. On the case back, there's quite a nice inscription of the Inter Milan logo, the 2 stars, and then as well, being this is a limited production piece, it'll have the number of the specific piece. They're limited to 1,908 pieces, and they were available in Italian locations, and then there's some sort of special order. These are special order models at the retailers, at Tudor retailers. So very, very limited edition piece. It's probably going to be quite a popular one among Italian collectors, perhaps Inter Milan fans. And it's a cool piece nonetheless. Check out the pictures of this. There'll be a link in the show notes if you want to see it, because I do think it's a very good looking piece. Another brand that released something quite interesting was Tag Heuer. They released a new Tag Heuer Monaco with a dark blue skeleton dial that I think is quite nice in DLC titanium. This was for I think they released it at the same time as the Monaco Grand Prix, which I think is quite cool. Congratulations, Charles Leclerc, for winning this year's Monaco GP. Quite an exciting time for a Monegasque to win the Monaco Grand Prix, especially given the results that he had in previous years. The Heuer Monaco is really nice. Case diameters 32 millimeters in diameter. As mentioned, The case material is this DLC coated titanium, which is quite nice. Obviously, it's going to be on the lighter side with that. You've got this blue and skeletonized dial that's really nice, and then a lot of super luminova that makes the dial stand out really nicely in darker environments, I guess. The watch comes on a blue calf skin and rubber strap, and it also has a folding clasp with double safety push buttons, which is quite nice. The watch isn't limited edition. It's going to be available starting in May 2024, and is about 11,000 Swiss francs. All right, getting to the fun stuff. So moving on to the Christie's auction. Christie's is going to be hosting their important watches auction in New York City on June the 10th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. As mentioned, this is the sort of New York leg of the summer auctions for Christie's. Overall, I think the collection of watches that they have curated for their sale straddles, everything from vintage to modern. I think there's definitely a larger emphasis on modern watches and independent pieces as well. I was really excited to see 3 MB&F models. Being an MB&F fan, there's a HMX, there's a LM1, and there's a LM Perpetual, which is, I think, a great little selection of what MB&F has produced. But there's watches from FP Journe, there's watches from other independent watch manufacturers like Grunefeld or Debuthune, which I think is quite exciting. But really, I think there was a little bit more focus on, in my mind, on the modern side of things, or at least neo-vintage, which has been kind of a trend that I've seen across the auctions that we've seen over the last, I'd say, 6 months. Nothing wrong with that, but I think it is just a reflection of maybe where the market is looking, interested in, etc., etc. I, of course, am always looking on the vintage side, just being a vintage fan, but there are many, many beautiful modern watches that are coming up for sale at Christie's. Actually, the first watch that I want to talk about is a modern piece, and this is a really nice and quite rare Rolex reference 228206. It's a day date watch in platinum with an ice blue dial and Arabic text numerals, which I think Eastern Arabic text numerals, which is really beautiful. This is an extremely rare model manufactured by Rolex in 2018. 40 millimeters in diameter. This is, in many people's minds, one of the pinnacles of Rolex collecting, and it's quite rare to see these come up for sale or even at auction. What's really interesting is they actually have 2 of these pieces. They have one with a titanium case with a smooth bezel, and there's another platinum version of a very similar watch day date with a diamond set bezel and a little bit of a darker blue numerals on the dial. So kind of a cool, rare, interesting, modern piece from Christie's, one that I think will do quite well, being such an attractive watch. Moving on, we'll kind of flip the coin over to the vintage side. There is a very nice. This is lot number. I should have actually told you that. Should have told you the lot number for that other piece. The lot number 12 and 13 are those day dates that I was referring to. We'll move on to lot number 59, which is a Rolex reference 6062 in 18 karat gold. This is a triple calendar watch with moon phase, and for hour indices, what's really beautiful is it has these incredible star hour markers, which I think is quite rare. In addition to this being obviously a very rare model from Rolex, overall, I'd say the case of this watch is extremely strong. If you flip the watch over and you look at the underside of the lug, you still have an incredibly clear hallmark. So probably, very. I don't even think this thing has been polished in my eyes. Obviously, you want to see these pieces in person. I hope to go and do a viewing of some of these pieces to really tell, but just by looking at the pictures, likely that it has very, very little polishing on this piece. So you have on one side modern Rolex, but you also have some really interesting vintage Rolexes that are selling as well. I think this will be a very strong lot. Obviously, Audemars Piguet Royal Oaks are all over the auction season. I don't typically talk about them, but there was one that I thought was really attractive to me. It's lot number 85. It is a reference 25594BA. Audemars Piguet. This is an 18 karat gold automatic Royal Oak with moon phase at 6 o'clock, as well as the day of the month, as well as the day of the week. So day date moon phase is essentially the complications that you have. I think what really made this watch stand out to me is this really clean white dial that's actually in porcelain. So I think that's a nice sort of contrast to what you typically see with Audemars Piguet watches. This piece is from the 1980s, so you can probably classify it in sort of that neo-vintage sort of section of watches. Being 36 millimeters in diameter, it's also an attractive size for someone who has smaller wrists. So I think the combination of what I think is a really great condition watch, as well as sort of this oddball porcelain dial for Royal Oaks, is really nice, and I think the complications are also very they're not useful, but I think they're ones that you would use. I don't think this would be a podcast about watch auctions if I didn't talk about a piece that had some sort of oxidation on the case. For the Geneva auctions, there's a really beautiful Rolex Daytona where half the case had oxidized, which I thought was quite cool. Today, for the Christie's auction, there's lot number 97, which is a Vacheron Constantin 222, reference 44018. It's a incredibly beautiful 18 karat gold 222 model from Rolex from 1985. Excuse me, not from Rolex, from Vacheron Constantin from 1985. Date complication, this is the Pinnacle 222, sort of what the inspiration of the modern 222 came from. An incredibly important piece, being that only 150 of these, approximately 150 of these were made in yellow gold. 37 millimeters in diameter, integrated bracelet. This is kind of where a lot of the inspiration behind a lot of the very collectible watches today sort of come from. But what's really amazing about this watch is if you take a look at the case, you have a little bit of gold that's oxidized nicely around the bezel of this watch. Additionally, if you take a look at the strap, you actually can see a little bit of oxidation on the bracelet, which I think is another sort of feature that's quite attractive. Flipping the watch over, you've got extremely clear hallmarks on the top of the case, or behind the top lugs. To me, again, another really great condition watch at Christie's. And I think that's what really makes these watches very important, is exceptional condition and obviously rarity. Of course, Vacheron Constantin also being my favorite brand. One of my favorite brands. Last lot I want to talk about is lot number 104. I mentioned with the May sort of auction previews, as well as the New York watch auction previews, that it appears that pocket watches are sort of getting a little bit more their time in the spotlight, which I think rightfully so they should be getting. There were some really nice complicated pocket watches, but also some time only pieces that were selling. That's, for me, I think quite exciting. Christie's doesn't have a ton of pocket watches, but one of the watches they do have is lot number 104. It's a Patek Philippe 18 karat pink gold cased watch with ruby set hour markers and enamel dial. It's made in homage of King, and I'm gonna probably butcher this, but King. There's a portrait of King Saud bin Abdulaziz Al Saud, who was the king of Saudi Arabia. These were made in approximately 200 pieces, so it's a fairly rare run of these reference 600 pocket watches. It was manufactured in 1954. Another, really cool feature is it has what is believed to be the original box. I think the watch is in overall fairly good condition as well. Case looks fairly strong, doesn't look like there's been too much wear. I'd say there's probably been a little bit of polishing on this piece, not too much, but that's just, obviously from pictures. I have to see this watch in person to really, have a perfect answer. I will say that the remarks on this lot say that they're very crisp. So perhaps, maybe there's no polishing that's been on them. But anyway, a very nice pocket watch. Ruby set, I think, is really, makes it stand out. Obviously, very limited edition as well from an exceptional brand. I can see this one also doing well. But again, it's exciting to me to see pocket watches sort of getting their opportunity for collectors. And so that is the auction for Christie. So be sure to tune in if you want to see some of these watches at auction. And also, I would recommend, if you're in the area, definitely go and see these pieces in person. Even if you aren't bidding, it's a nice way to sort of explore these watches. All right, so we'll cover the last thing we'll do is talk about 3 watches that are going to be covered on livefromthewrist.com as well as the Life from the Wrist YouTube channel. We'll start off with a really beautiful Girard-Perregaux reference 6211. It's a stainless steel, what I describe as a stainless steel sports watch. What's really exciting about this piece is the condition of the case. I'd say it has an extremely strong case. Definitely some signs of wear. If you look at the case back, you can see some scratches, but I think overall the lugs have really nice, sharp angles to them. It was manufactured in the 1950s, and as I mentioned, stainless steel case, time-only piece with center seconds. The lugs are really long and sort of angled towards the wrist. It's only 32 millimeters in diameter, so it is on the smaller side. What's really nice is the dial of this watch is aged quite evenly. It's a white dial that's sort of aged to this sort of warm cream tone, which I think is really attractive. It also has applied hour markers and sword hands with numbers at 3, 6, 9, and 12, so it kind of gives that Explorer-esque feel. It's running on the caliber 47 BF automatic movement, which is a really nice, robust movement manufactured by Girard-Perregaux. I believe it's a modified ETA movement, if I'm not mistaken. What's really cool about this piece is the reference 6211 seems to come in 2 versions, one being versions that are signed Girard-Perregaux with automatic beneath the on the dial. These are obviously earlier versions of the 1950s, and then there's other versions that are manufactured with Girard-Perregaux written, and then below that is Gyromatic. Gyromatic was launched, I think, in 1957, so those obviously are in the later half of the 50s. But it's cool that this one is sort of an earlier version of this reference, and I think it's a really attractive piece. Very looking forward to diving into that specific piece. The next watch is a Longines. It's a sort of tank-style square watch. Obviously, Longines watches sold in the U.S. market don't typically have references, but the case reference is 105-818. It's a I believe 10-karat gold filled case with a really unique sort of lug design where the lugs angle upwards towards the top of the dial as opposed to down towards the wrist. So it does have sort of an interesting profile to it. It's got this really nice silver sunburst dial with applied hour markers, Longines logo, and gold hands, and obviously subsidiary seconds. It's running on the caliber 370 Manuan movement, which is a really beautifully finished Longines movement from the 60s. This specific watch was manufactured in 1966. I think, again, it's just another example of how Longines produced exceptionally well-made watches, movements, you name it, during this era. And it's a nice sort of tank style watch that can be enjoyed by many collectors. The last watch is a Bulova. It's a reference 386-4. This reference was nicknamed the Devil Divers, but it's the watches that were released in the 1960s by Bulova with 666 feet of water waterproofness, I guess. These watches were extremely popular, very sort of wide range of watches that Bulova produced. They had some chronographs that they had. They also had these dive watches. We covered a 386-1 on the channel probably about 2 years ago. And I think this is another really wonderful example. As I mentioned, this is from the 60s. This one was manufactured in 1968. It's got a stainless steel case that's 35 millimeters in diameter. There are some signs of obviously wear and a little bit of like polishing, as the lugs maybe a little bit are softer around the corners, but the lugs are overall really thick, and they sit relatively flat, which makes the 35 millimeter case sit larger. It's got this stainless steel bidirectional dive bezel, a signed Bulova crown, and I think what really makes this watch special is the dial. It's got this incredible black dial that's aged almost perfectly, and then the luminescent material and the hour markers are really fat and creamy and match, across all hour markers, which I think is really significant. It's got a date window at 3 o'clock and runs on the caliber 11 AFAC movement. For me, I think the dial of this watch is really what makes it incredible. It's aged so nicely, and overall maintains a really beautiful look for vintage dive watches. So I think that will be about it for this week's episode of the Life of Nurse podcast. Let me know what you think about any of the new watch releases, the watches that are going to be sold at Christie's next month, as well as these vintage watches that we're going to be covering on the channel. I'm looking forward to hearing from you, as well as covering all these pieces in the weeks to come. If you did not listen to our podcast last week, we covered Sotheby's as well as the Phillips New York watch auctions that are going to be taking place next month. Picked out a few favorites, so if you didn't listen to that, be sure to go back to the archives and you can take a listen. I will also mention again that we covered the 3 vintage watches that we discussed at the end of this podcast in a video that will be out by the time you listen to this podcast. So be sure to have a watch there if you want to see those pieces in the metal before we cover them individually. If you are new to the Life on the Wrist podcast, be sure to follow this podcast so you are notified when we upload our podcast. We publish a podcast every week. So we talk about sort of the modern side of watches, or sort of the things that are happening today in watches on the podcast. And then we obviously cover vintage watches on our website and YouTube channel. So we kind of have the mix of both topics, or both areas of watch collecting. If you are feeling generous and wouldn't mind rating this podcast, it really does help me out. Be sure to share this podcast with a friend who might be interested in watches. There will be links to all of our websites and social media accounts in the show notes of this video, or show notes of this podcast, so be sure to head over there if you want to get some more content from Life on the Wrist. With that said, guys, thank you so much for listening to this podcast, and until next time.